Most movies about mental illness are terrible. That's not to say that the movies themselves are bad. Hollywood's long-running fascination with psychiatry has led to the production of a number of award-winning films featuring mental disorders, including schizophrenia in A Beautiful Mind, bipolar disorder in Silver Linings Playbook, autism in Rain Man, and obsessive-compulsive disorder in As Good as It Gets. However, even the best-made movies about mental illness tend to do a pretty poor job of depicting what living with these conditions is actually like, with patients, families, and mental health care professionals all saying that what they see on the screen rarely matches up with their everyday experience. Where does this gap between the quality of a film and its real-world accuracy come from? One possible explanation involves the fact that movies, unlike other forms of entertainment like books or music, are a distinctly visual medium. When translating the experience of mental illness onto the screen, there is tremendous pressure to depict these conditions in a way that is visually striking. However, the reality of mental illness is that most of its symptoms involve more abstract concepts like thought and emotions that are harder to show on screen. Even when symptoms do involve the senses, such as the hallucinations that occur in schizophrenia, they tend to be auditory in nature rather than visual. Nevertheless, for filmmakers, the temptation to show these symptoms visually is often too strong to resist, leading to a depiction that is at odds with what we know about these conditions. While the visual nature of movies goes some way towards bridging this gap, it is ultimately a somewhat superficial explanation. A more fundamental reason for the troubled history of mental illness in cinema goes beyond the medium itself and instead cuts to the very nature of what makes for a good story. Stories in general, and movies in particular, are defined by how well they follow an organized narrative structure. We watch movies because they tell stories that make sense, with a series of events playing out in a logical order. We cheer when the good guys come back from the brink to put the bad guys in their place, but we want it to happen in the right way. With stories, this right way involves the presence of three narrative elements: temporality, causality, and character. We need to see that things are not only happening, but happening in order, for a reason, and as the direct result of the personalities and motivations of the characters on screen. Let's use an example to show how these narrative elements work. Imagine this scenario. A thief is arrested by the police. This isn't a story yet, but it will be. First, let's add temporality. After stealing a diamond, a thief is arrested by the police. Next, let's add causality. After stealing a diamond, a thief is arrested by the police following a tip-off from an informant. Finally, let's add character. After stealing a diamond, a noble thief is arrested by the corrupt police following a tip-off from a backstabbing informant. How did your interest in this scenario change as we added these three elements? For most people, the addition of temporality, causality, and character greatly increases engagement in what's going on. These are the magic ingredients that transform a series of events into an attractive and compelling narrative. While movies require a high degree of organization to be successful, many mental illnesses are instead defined by their inherent disorganization. We want stories to make sense, but mental illnesses often do anything but. This disorganization not only interferes with storytelling generally, but does so in a way that specifically hinders attempts to establish temporality, causality, and character. Let's look at each of these in more detail, starting with temporality. We are drawn to stories that have a clear beginning, middle, and end. In movies, this classically takes the form of a three-act structure in which there is a setup and inciting incident in Act 1, a rise in action and conflict in Act 2, and finally a climax and resolution in Act 3. The original Star Wars is a perfect example. You get the setup in Act 1, the conflict in Act 2, and the resolution in Act 3. Or how about The Lion King? Setup in Act 1, conflict in Act 2, resolution in Act 3. Even more lighthearted genres like comedy follow a similar format: setup, conflict, and resolution. This same structure is also found in movies about mental illness. In A Beautiful Mind, for example, Act 1 sets up that John Nash is a mathematician who wants to do something that matters, to find a truly original idea. In Act 2, it's revealed that his attempts to do so by working with the FBI are in fact a symptom of schizophrenia, which he must then use his mind to overcome. By Act 3, Nash effectively beats schizophrenia by developing the ability to separate reality from fantasy, allowing him to finally achieve his dream of doing something that matters. Setup, conflict, and resolution. In real life, however, mental illnesses do not fit easily into this rigid structure. They are rarely one-off challenges that can be vanquished and moved on from. Instead, many mental illnesses are chronic or recurrent, more like diabetes than the flu. Most cases of depression and bipolar disorder involve repeated cycles of unstable mood, while virtually all cases of schizophrenia result in ongoing symptoms and disability across the entire lifespan. Other disorders, like dementia, cannot be beaten by any modern treatments, making for a conflict with no resolution. Like a musical chord that never resolves, the chronic nature of mental illness makes for an uneasy mix with the expectations of temporality. Mental illness also offers unsatisfying explanations when it comes to causality. When we watch a series of events on screen, we want them to be happening for a reason. We want the lovers to reunite because they are destined to be together, or the mighty ship to sink because of the folly of man's hubris. We want the events on screen to reflect some sort of underlying lesson or truth. However, when talking about the causes of mental illness, these meaningful explanations are hard to find. Despite decades of research, we still don't really know why one person develops a disorder while another person doesn't, outside of a few vague clues related to their genetics or upbringing. For this reason, it can be hard to draw any meaningful conclusions or find any great significance from the coming or going of any particular disorder. Sometimes, mental illness just happens. This lack of an explanation, while scientifically accurate, is emotionally unfulfilling, and even deeply unsettling for its underlying implications about the inherent randomness of the universe. This is not the causality that people come to theaters to see. Of the three narrative elements, character development is the one that is perhaps most disrupted by mental illness. We want our characters to have willpower and agency, to speak and act in ways that make sense in the context of their desires and goals. We want Neo to choose the red pill because he is brave enough to know the truth, or Katniss to volunteer for the Hunger Games because she is selfless enough to protect her sister. Unfortunately, many mental illnesses obscure, rather than reveal, one's inner desires and ambitions. Disorders like depression, dementia, and schizophrenia often present with deficits in motivation, planning, and socialization, making it hard for people with these conditions to dream about the future, to speak about the things that are important to them, and to engage in interpersonal relationships, the very things that are essential for creating a compelling character. In order to craft a narrative around these limitations, filmmakers often resort to tropes and stereotypes to depict characters with mental illness. Whether it's the free-spirited rebel whose unique perspective gives them great insight, the brilliant savant whose skill with numbers is matched only by his clumsiness with people, or the unhinged psychotic maniac who has gone on a killing spree, these archetypes are instantly recognizable, and because we are familiar with them, we are more easily swept into the world of the film. However, these stereotypes also fail to capture the nuance and complexity of genuine mental illness. Filmmakers often either dial down the most severe elements of the disorder to create a heavily sanitized version more akin to a brief illness or personality quirk, or they turn up the volume on the disorganized elements so high that the character becomes something alien and frightening. Either way, the stereotype on the screen no longer bears much of a resemblance to the lives of real people with the disorder. These effects on temporality, causality, and character add up, making it increasingly difficult to tell a story that is capable of both satisfying audiences and staying true to the realities of mental illness. Faced with this conundrum, filmmakers will often prioritize the quality of the movie over its scientific validity. While this potentially makes for better movies, the lack of real-world accuracy can also have real-world consequences. Media depictions of mental illness have the power to inform how we as a society view people with mental disorders, as well as how we feel that they should be treated. If movies inaccurately depict mental illness as something minor or trivial, a temporary setback that can be overcome with only determination and willpower, that can make people less likely to seek treatment or, if they do get help, to feel ashamed that they could not do it on their own. On the other hand, if movies instead portray mental illness as something unknowable, something scary, something horrifying to be afraid of, this can make people shun, avoid, or even harm others with mental illness. Indeed, multiple studies have shown that people with severe mental illnesses are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, yet the stereotype of the homicidal madman continues to persist in the popular imagination. This is just one example, but it underscores an important point. Media matters. I am reminded of something that occurs from time to time when I tell people I'm a psychiatrist. Occasionally, someone will respond by saying, "Tell me a fun story about a crazy patient you saw recently." This is always a difficult request for me. I fear that it will sour the mood if I tell them an actual story about mental illness. If I talk about the father I saw with OCD who is so fearful of germs that he has not touched his family in several years, or about the girl I saw with anorexia so severe that she lived her entire senior year in the hospital, or about the man I saw who will never walk again because he happened to be on the sidewalk when a suicidal person jumped from the building above. I can't help but shake the feeling that these are not the stories they're looking for. They're looking for the kind of story that Hollywood has gotten so good at marketing, organized stories that take advantage of the supposed magic of mental illness to make themselves more thrilling, bizarre, or mysterious than they otherwise would be. These stories are ultimately intended to provoke feelings not of empathy, compassion, and kindness, but rather of amusement, otherness, and fear. Those are the exact emotions that are least helpful for people and families struggling with these disorders, and that is why most movies about mental illness are terrible. Thanks so much for watching. If you know of any movies that do a particularly good or bad job of depicting mental illness, please leave a comment below. If you'd like to learn more about the realities of mental disorders, my book Memorable Psychiatry has the information you need to be knowledgeable and informed. Until next time, have a wonderful rest of your day.